Hello, my name is Brayden Johnson, and today I'll be presenting on Japanese prisoner of war camps during World War II, focusing on the conditions inside these camps, the experiences of the prisoners, and the long-term historical impact. This topic is especially important when studying the Pacific theater of World War II, because treatment of prisoners of wars by Japan differed significantly from what was seen throughout Europe. Throughout the presentation, we'll start with the broader context of the war, then move into daily life in the camps, and finally examine the aftermath and the legacy. The goal is to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and how it continues to shape historical memory even in today's world. To understand Japanese prisoner of war camps, we need to first look at the broader context of World War II in the Pacific. Japan had already been expanding its empire throughout Asia in the 1930s, particularly in China. When Japan decided to attack, Pearl Harbor in 1941 brought the United States fully into the war. Following this, Japan quickly captured large areas of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. These rapid victories led to the capture of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. With so many prisoners, Japan established a wide network of prisoner of war camps across all of its territories, setting the stage for the conditions that we will be discussing further. Prisoners held in Japanese camps came from a wide range of Allied nations. Many of them were American, British, and Australian soldiers captured during Japanese victories, especially in places like the Philippines and Singapore. There were also a large number of Dutch soldiers captured after Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, as well as Filipino troops who had been fighting alongside U.S. forces. In addition to military personnel, some civilians, such as missionaries, government officials, and even family members, were also interned into similar situations in these camps. Altogether, over 130,000 Allied prisoners were held by Japan, making this a significant humanitarian issue throughout the war. Japanese military. One of the key reasons for the harsh treatment of prisoner of war lies in Japanese military culture at the time. The Japanese army was heavily influenced by Bushido, the traditional code of the Japanese samurai, which had emphasized honor, loyalty, and bravery. Within the belief system, surrendering to the enemy was also considered deeply shameful. Because Allied soldiers had surrendered, many Japanese soldiers viewed them as dishonorable and undeserving of their respect. This cultural mindset contributed to the widespread mistreatment of prisoners, as guards often felt justified in treating them harshly. Understanding this ideology is essential to understanding why conditions in these camps were so severe, especially for Japan. Another major factor was Japan's failure to fully follow international laws regarding prisoners of war. Although Japan had signed the Geneva Convention, it did not mean that they fully were following it in compliance. This meant that many of the protections that prisoners of war were supposed to receive, such as adequate food, medical care, and even just humane treatment, was often ignored. In addition, there was no consistent system across these camps. Individual commanders had significant authority, which led to wide variations in how the prisoners were treated from camp to camp. In many cases, the lack of oversight resulted in extremely harsh and often brutal conditions. Japanese prisoner of war camps were spread across a vast geographic area, reflecting the size of Japan's empire during the war. These camps were located in places like Philippines, China, Korea, Japan, and throughout Southeast Asia, including Thailand, Burma, and Indonesia. Many of the camps were deliberately placed in remote or isolated regions in hopes to make escape very, very difficult and limiting outside visibility into what was happening inside of these camps. Additionally, camps are often located near areas where labor was needed, such as construction sites, a mine, or a railroad. The placement was not accidental, as it followed the Japanese military allowed the Japanese military to easily use prisoners as a labor force to support their war efforts and expansion. While prisoner of war camps are often thought of simply as detention centers, in the case of Japan during World War II, they served as multiple purposes. First, they were used to hold captured enemy soldiers and prevent them from returning to combat. However, a major function of these camps was to supply forced labor. Prisoners were used to build infrastructure like railways, roads, airfields, mines, factories. This helped Japan conserve its own manpower for the front lines. In many of these cases, the camps were closely tied to specific labor projects, meaning that prisoners were essentially treated as a workforce rather than individuals or humans that had human rights. Conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps were generally very harsh and often life-threatening. Although there was some variation depending on the location and leadership of each camp, certain problems were widespread. Prisoners commonly faced severe food shortages, which led to malnutrition and weakness. Disease was also an issue. This was due to poor sanitation and an extreme lack of medical care. Physical abuse from guards was also very common, creating an environment of constant fear. Overcrowding made living conditions worse, and prisoners were often packed into small spaces without proper ventilation and definitely not proper hygiene. Overall, these conditions contributed to a high death rate among prisoners of war. Daily life in the camps was highly structured and controlled by the Japanese guards. Prisoners typically would wake up very early in the morning and required to attend roll calls. These could last for hours, especially if something was wrong or if the guards were in a bad mood and wanted to punish them. After roll call, most prisoners were sent out to work for long hours, often in physically demanding conditions. There was very little time for rest, and personal freedom was almost non-existent. Even when not working, prisoners were under constant supervision from the guards. The strict routine, combined with harsh discipline, created a stressful and an exhausting daily existence for the prisoners of war. Food was one of the biggest challenges faced by prisoners. Typical diet in Japanese prisoner of war camps was extremely limited and lacked essential nutrients. Most prisoners were given small portions of rice, sometimes to be accompanied by vegetables, but very, very rarely was any sort of meat or any sort of protein. Total number of calories was often far below of what was needed. Some people listed that it was even under 1,500 calories a day for these prisoners of war, And that made it doing essential tasks that were asked upon them, such as the labor force that they were required to do, very, very difficult. As a result, as you can imagine, many of the prisoners of war were severely malnourished and weak. And it not only weakened their bodies, but it also made them very much more vulnerable to disease and less able to endure the harsh conditions of everyday camp life. Starvation was a constant and serious issue in the Japanese prisoner of war camps, and it had devastating effects on prisoners. This is because food rations were so limited and lacked essential nutrients that many prisoners experienced rapid and extreme weight loss, as pictured here. Over time, their bodies began to break down, leading to weakness, fatigue, and an inability to perform any sort of physical labor. In some cases, prisoners became so desperate that they resorted to eating whatever they could find, including grass, insects, scraps, or even garbage. Starvation also had mental effects, making it harder for prisoners to concentrate or maintain hope at all. Ultimately, it played a major role in a high death rate that we're seeing throughout these camps. Disease spread quickly in prisoner of war camps due to poor sanitation, overcrowding, and weakened immune systems. Some of the most common diseases included malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and cholera. Many of these illnesses were linked to contaminated water, poor hygiene, or vitamin deficiencies caused by inadequate diets. Because prisoners were already weakened by starvation, they were more vulnerable to infection, and in those cases where a normal person might be able to recover, these people and their malnourished bodies were not able to recover. In many cases, sick prisoners were still forced to work, which made their conditions even worse and increased the likelihood of death, which was seen a lot. Disease, alongside starvation, was one of the leading causes of mortality in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Medical care in Japanese prisoner of war camps was extremely limited and often inadequate. There were severe shortages of basic supplies such as medicine, bandages, and surgical tools. Many camps, Allied doctors, who were themselves prisoners, had to improvise treatments using whatever materials they were able to find. For example, they might reuse bandages or create a makeshift medical equipment to use on themselves. Despite their efforts, the lack of proper resources made it difficult to treat serious illnesses or injuries. In some cases, Japanese guards denied requests for medical attention or did not prioritize the care of sick prisoners. As a result, as you could imagine, many conditions that could have been treated and could have kept these people alive turned them into a deathly cause. Physical abuse was a common part of life in many Japanese prisoner of war camps. Guards often would use violence to enforce discipline, punish prisoners for even minor infractions. This could include slapping, punching, kicking, or beating prisoners with objects. Punishments were sometimes carried out publicly to intimidate others. In addition to physical violence, prisoners could be subjected to harsh disciplinary measures such as being forced to stand for long periods, being denied food, being exposed to extreme weather conditions. In some cases, entire groups of prisoners were punished for the actions of a single individual. This constant threat of punishment created an atmosphere of total fear and total control from the Japanese guards and officers. In addition to physical hardships, prisoners also faced a significant amount of psychological challenges. Living under constant stress, fear, and uncertainty took a major toll on their mental health. Prisoners were cut off from families, had little information about the progress of the war, which would add to their anxiety. Many of these people experienced depression, anxiety, and loss of hope. However, despite these conditions, prisoners found ways to cope. They would form strong bonds with one another, shared stories, and created a routine to try their best to maintain a sense of normal life. These social connections were crucial for survival for many of the survivors, helping prisoners maintain hope even in the most difficult time and circumstances. Forced labor was one of the central aspects of the prisoner of war camp system under Japan during World War II. Prisoners were not simply held in captivity, they were actively used as a labor force to support Japan's military and their economic needs. This labor included building infrastructure like roads, railways, airfields, as well as working in mines or factories, and even sometimes docks, depending on their location. Work was often physically exhausting and would have to perform under extreme conditions such as intense heat, heavy rain, or rough terrain. Prisoners were given little rest and were expected to meet strict quotas regardless of their physical condition. Those who could not keep up would be punished, often in front of others, to intimidate fear. The system treated prisoner of war as an expendable resource rather than a human. It contributed heavily to the prisoner of war's suffering and death. The Burma-Thailand Railway. One of the most infamous examples of forced labor involving prisoner of war was the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, often called the Death Railway. Built between 1942 and 1943, this railway was intended to connect Thailand and Burma to support Japanese military operations. The project had stretched over 250 miles through dense jungle and mountainous terrain. Around 60,000 Allied prisoners of war were forced to work on it, along with a much larger number of Asian civilian laborers. The conditions were extremely harsh, and the pace of construction was intense. Their work was said that it was demanded to quickly be finished, which created a high and intense atmosphere for the workers who were part of this project. The conditions faced by those working on the Death Railway were among the worst experienced by prisoners of war during the war. The environment itself was incredibly challenging. The extreme heat, high humidity, and often heavy rainfall. Workers had to deal with dangerous terrain, including thick jungle, rivers, and rocky hillsides. Prisoners of war were given extremely basic tools, meaning that most of their work was done by hand. Food was scarce, and medical care was almost non-existent. These factors, combined with long working hours and harsh treatment by guards, created an environment where survival for these people was very difficult. Many prisoners became seriously ill or even injured while working on the railway. The cost of the railway. Human cost of building the Burma-Thailand Railway was devastating. The approximately 60,000 Allied prisoners of war who worked on the railway, it was said that over 12,000 of them died as a result to the conditions. In addition to these prisoners of war, tens of thousands of Asian laborers were also forced to work on the project, and many of them died as well. Causes of death included disease, starvation, exhaustion, and physical abuse. Sheer number of deaths and the suffering involved made the death railway one of the most well-known symbols of the brutality of Japanese prisoner of war camp systems. It'll stand out as a powerful example of how forced labor contributed to high mortality rates forever. While the death railway is one of the most famous examples, it was far from the only labor project involving prisoners of war. Across the Japanese Empire, prisoners were used in a variety of other roles. They built airfields on Pacific Islands, worked in coal and metal mines in Japan and Korea, and labored in factories producing materials for the war effort. Some were also involved in shipbuilding or unloading supplies coming in from ships at docks near ports. These jobs are often just as dangerous and exhausting as the railway work. Conditions were consistently harsh. The widespread use of prisoner of war labor highlights how important these prisoners were to sustaining Japanese wartime economy for their military, even though they were treated with very little regard for their survival. As war progressed, some prisoners of war were transferred from Southeast Asia to camps on the Japanese mainland. These prisoners were often used in industrial labor, working in factories, shipyards, and mines that were directly supported Japanese war production. Some aspects of organization were slightly more structured compared to jungle camps. Conditions were still extremely harsh. Prisoners had to endure long hours of labor with minimal food and poor living conditions. One additional danger in Japan was exposure to Allied bombing raids, as many prisoner of war camps were located near industrial targets. Prisoners had very little protection during these attacks, putting them at risk not only from their captors, but also of the war ongoing itself. Several prisoner of war camps became especially well known for their harsh conditions and high death rates. For example, the Cabanatuan in the Philippines held thousands of American prisoners and became infamous for the disease and starvation that occurred. Chiang Camp in Singapore was one of the largest camps, and while slightly more organized, still suffered from overcrowding and shortages. The Fukuoka Camp in Japan, well known for forced labor and dangerous industrial settings. Sandakan, located in Borneo, became one of the most deadly camps due to extreme neglect and brutal treatment. Each of these camps had unique characteristics. They all shared a common theme: suffering, deprivation, and a high death rate. The Sandakan death marches, one of the most tragic events involving Japanese prisoner of war camps, happened in 1945. As Allied forces approached, Japanese guards forced over 2,000 prisoners, mostly Australian and British, to march long distances through the jungle. Prisoners were already weakened by starvation and disease, making their journey extremely difficult. They were given very little food or water. Those who could not keep up were often left behind or killed. Out of the thousands who began the marches, only a handful had survived. This event is considered one of the worst atrocities committed against prisoner of wars in the Pacific, highlights the extreme brutality that could occur as the war neared its end. The mortality rate among prisoners of war held in Japan was significantly higher than its other parts of the world during World War II. It is estimated that around 25 to 30% of Allied prisoners in Japanese camps died during captivity. This is in stark contrast to German prisoner of war camps in Europe, where the death rate was closer to 4%. The high mortality rate in Japanese camps can be attributed to several factors, including starvation, disease, forced labor, and physical abuse. These statistics can just help illustrate how severe the conditions were and why Japanese prisoner of war camps are often remembered as some of the harshest of the war. Treatment in Japanese prisoner of war camps could vary depending on the nationality of the prisoners. Though conditions were generally harsh for all, Western Allied prisoners such as Americans, British, and Australians were often grouped together, while Asian prisoners, including Filipino soldiers, were sometimes treated even more severely. Racial attitudes and cultural biases also played a role in how prisoners were viewed and treated by their captors. However, it's important to note that while there were differences, the overall system was harsh across the board. Most prisoners, regardless of nationality, experienced significant hardship, and survival often depended more on location and leadership than the nationality alone. Camp commanders played a major role in shaping conditions within each prisoner of war camp. Because there was no strict, consistently enforced system governing of how prisoners should be treated, it was much more dependent on the personality and leadership style of the individual that was in charge at that specific camp. Some commanders enforced extremely harsh discipline and allowed or even encouraged abuse, while others were somewhat more lenient and tried to maintain order within the camp without having to excess brutal physical abuse. However, even in camps with relatively less severe leadership, conditions were still difficult due to shortages in the overall system. This lack of standardization meant that a prisoner's experience could vary significantly depending on where they were held and who would be in charge. The guards who directly supervised prisoners of war were often lower-ranking soldiers, and their behavior varied widely. Many guards were under intense pressure from their superiors and were expected to maintain strict discipline, sometimes through harsh measures. This pressure could lead them to take out their frustrations on prisoners. Some guards were known for extreme cruelty, using violence regularly, while others showed occasional moments of kindness. It's important to recognize that not all guards behaved in the same way, but the overall environment encouraged strict control, and often abuse was normalized. These interactions between guards and prisoners shaped much of the daily experience of the prisoners of war in these camps. Cultural differences between Japanese captors and Allied prisoners played a significant role in how prisoners of war were treated. Japanese military culture, surrender was seen as a sign of weakness and dishonor, influenced by traditional values such as Bushido. In contrast, Allied soldiers often viewed surrender as a necessary decision to preserve life when the defeat was inevitable. A fundamental difference like this led to the lack of respect for prisoners and contributed heavily to their mistreatment. Additionally, language barriers made communication difficult, leading to misunderstandings and sometimes harsh punishments for actions that would be misinterpreted. Cultural gaps deepened the divide between their captors and the prisoners. Despite the dangers, many prisoners of war found ways to resist their captors, though this resistance was usually subtle rather than a direct form. Often rebellion was extremely risky and often resulted in severe punishment or death. Instead, prisoners engaged in smaller acts of defiance, such as slowing their work down, sabotaging equipment, or hiding or stealing tools. These actions were ways to push back against their treatment without drawing too much attention to them. In addition to physical acts, simply maintaining morale and refusing to give in mentally was considered a form of resistance. These efforts helped prisoners retain a sense of control and dignity in an otherwise oppressive environment. Communication was essential for survival in prisoner of war camps, and often prisoners developed creative ways to share information despite restrictions. They often used whispered conversations, hidden codes, or coded messages to pass along news or coordinate actions or plans. Information about the progress of war was especially valuable. It gave prisoners more hope that liberation might come soon. Communication also allowed prisoners to organize support systems, share resources, and most importantly, maintain a sense of community. Even though guards tried to limit these interactions, these networks played a crucial role in helping prisoners endure the hardships of their life in camp. Within the camps, leadership among the prisoners themselves played a crucial role in survival. Senior officers, especially in military groups, often would take responsibility for organizing daily life among the prisoners. They helped establish routines, assign responsibilities, and maintain discipline within the group. This internal structure was important because it created a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic environment. Leaders also worked to fairly distribute limited resources like food and clothing, which could help prevent conflict among prisoners. Many of these cases, strong leadership improved morale and increased the chances of survival by fostering cooperation and mutual support. Religion was an important source of strength for many prisoners. Even under harsh conditions, prisoners of war often found ways to hold religious services, whether in open or in secret. These gatherings provided comfort, a sense of hope, and a way to cope with the constant stress of life imprisonment. Prayer and shared beliefs helped many prisoners maintain a sense of purpose and resilience. Beyond religion itself, these activities also strengthened bonds among prisoners, creating a sense of community in an environment where so much was taken away. Faith became one of the few things that prisoners could hold on to for emotional support. As the war had progressed, there were some key battles to shift the balance of power in the favor of the Allies. One major turning point was the Battle of Midway, where the United States dealt a significant blow to the Japanese Navy. Another important campaign was the Guadalcanal campaign, which marked the beginning of a sustained Allied offense into the Pacific. As Japan began to lose its territory, supply lines for them became much less, including those that were going to prisoner of war camps. This often led to worsened condition for prisoners, as food and resources had now become even more limited towards the end of the war here. Conditions in prisoner of war often deteriorated further as the war neared its end. Japan faced increasing shortages of food, medicine, and supplies, and these shortages directly would affect the prisoners. Guards, who were also under the stress of facing a possible defeat, had now become often more unpredictable and even more aggressive. In some cases, prisoners were forced to continue heavy labor despite being severely weakened and malnourished. There were also instances where camps were completely abandoned or prisoners were moved, creating additional danger and more uncertainty. Many prisoners of war feared what might happen to them if Japan lost the war, including the possibility of being executed to prevent their liberation. Liberation came as Allied forces advanced into territories previously held by Japan. For many prisoners, liberation happened suddenly and unexpectedly. When troops arrived at the camps, they often found prisoners in extremely poor physical condition. Many of them were sick and barely able to move. Immediate medical attention was critical, and relief efforts focused on providing food, clean water, and health care as needed. However, refeeding had to be done carefully. Their bodies were so severely malnourished that Most of these people could not handle large amounts of food right away. Liberation was a moment of relief and joy, but it also marked the beginning of a long recovery process for these survivors. The war in the Pacific came to a dramatic and sudden end in August 1945, following the use of the atomic bomb by the United States. Cities of atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastating, leading to Japan's ultimate decision to surrender. This surrender was officially announced in September 1945. For prisoners of war, this moment marked the ends of years of captivity and suffering. Orders were issued to the Japanese forces to cease hostiles and release the prisoners. However, in some areas, communications delays meant that liberation did not happen immediately, and these prisoners remained on certain conditions for a short period, even after the war had officially ended. After liberation had occurred, the condition of many prisoners of war were shocked, the Allied forces and medical personnel. Prisoners were often severely malnourished, suffering from diseases, and very often physically weakened from the years of forced labor on a weak body. Many required immediate hospitalization and long-term medical care. In addition to physical recovery, there was also significant impact emotionally and psychologically. Reuniting with family members after years of separation was powerful, but sometimes an overwhelming experience. Some survivors struggled to adjust to a normal life again, as the trauma of their experiences stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The recovery process, both physical and mental, would take many, many, many years for these former prisoners of war. Following the end of the war, Allied nations began investigating the treatment of prisoners in these Japanese camps. These investigations relied heavily on testimony from survivors, as well as documents and evidence that was collected from the former camps. The goal was to identify those responsible for the abuse, forced labor, and death of the prisoners. Investigators looked at both direct actions, such as physical abuse, and broader policies that led to poor conditions. These efforts were part of a larger push to hold individuals accountable for war crimes and to establish a record of what had occurred during the war. One of the most significant outcomes of these investigations was a series of trials known as the Tokyo War Crime Trials. Held between 1946 and 1948, these trials focused on high-ranking Japanese leaders who were accused of committing war crimes, including the mistreatment of prisoners of war. Defendants faced charges related to planning and carrying out aggressive war, as well as violations of international law. Some were found guilty and received severe sentences, including imprisonment or execution. These trials were an important step in establishing accountability, although they have also been debated by historians in terms of fairness. The long-term effects being held in Japanese prisoner of war camps were significant and often lifelong. Physically, many of these survivors continue to deal with health issues that was caused by the malnutrition, disease, and extreme overwork. Psychologically, many experience what we now recognize as PTSD. This would often include flashbacks, extreme anxiety, and extreme depression. Adjusting back to civilian life was not always easy, as former prisoners of war had to rebuild their lives after years of hardship. At the same time, many survivors formed strong bonds with fellow prisoners. These relationships often lasted throughout their lives. Their stories have become an important part of the historical record. The legacy of Japanese prisoner of war camps remains a significant part of World War II history. especially when examining the Pacific. These camps are often remembered for their extreme conditions and high mortality rates, which stood in contrast to prisoner of war experiences that were seen in Europe. The events that took place in these camps have been widely studied by historians and have contributed to a deeper understanding of how cultural, military, and logistical factors can shape the treatment of prisoners. Additionally, the legacy of these camps has influenced modern discussions about the rules of war and importance of enforcing international standards of humane treatment of prisoners. The experiences of prisoners of war in Japan camps have been represented in various forms of media, including books, films, and documentaries. One well-known example is Unbroken, which is a movie that shows the story of Louis Zamperini, a former Olympic runner who was stranded at sea and eventually captured by the Japanese military and later liberated back to the United States. While such films help bring awareness to a broader audience, they often dramatize or simplify certain aspects of the real events. Personal memoirs and survival accounts are also important sources, providing first-hand perspectives on the life in these camps. These representations have played a major role in shaping a public understanding and memory of what these prisoners of war endured during World War II. In the decades following World War II, relationships between Japan and the former Allied nations have gradually improved. There have been major efforts toward reconciliation, including official statements of apology from Japan leaders regarding their wartime actions. However, the issue remains complex, as not all survivors or nations feel that these apologies have fully addressed the suffering that was experienced. Some former prisoners of war and their families have sought additional recognition, compensation, or acknowledgement. These ongoing discussions highlight the legacy of wartime actions continue to affect international relationships and historical memory long after a conflict has ended. Remembering the experiences of prisoner of war is essential for several reasons. First, it honors the individuals who endured extreme hardship and in many cases lost their lives. Second, it helps educate future generations about the realities of war, going beyond battles and strategies to focus on the true human experiences. Understanding these events also reinforces the importance of international laws and human rights, particularly those related to the treatment of prisoners. By studying this history, we can better recognize the consequences of ignoring such standards and work to prevent similar situations in the future. Conclusion, Japanese prisoners of war camps during World War II were marked by severe conditions, including starvation, disease, forced labor, and extreme physical abuse. These conditions were influenced by a combination of cultural beliefs, military priorities, and logistical challenges. Despite these hardships, many prisoners demonstrated remarkable resilience and relied on cooperation and inner strength to survive. The stories of these individuals provide valuable insight into the human cost of war and remain an important part of historical study. Ultimately, this topic reminds us of the importance of humane treatment even during times of conflict, and the lasting impact that such experiences can have on individuals, societies, and entire generations. Thank you. My name is Brayden Johnson, and I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about what it was like in prisoner of war camps of Japan during World War II.